A bishop sits at his writing table in the autumn of 1379, reviewing a document his lawyers have spent months drafting. It is a foundation charter, pages of Latin clauses establishing a college at Oxford, listing the manors, rectories, and urban properties that will fund it forever. He is not a young man. He has spent 3 decades in royal service, and none of that money is what people will remember him for. What they will remember is what happens to it after he signs. Now picture the other end of the same institution. A young scholar in his early 20s has just finished the last examination of an 8-year education. Before he can call himself a master, he owes fees to the university, fees to the College of Doctors, and a fee to a church official standing at the door. And then he is expected to personally fund a feast for every senior figure who might otherwise vote against his admission. The statutes technically forbid him from staging a tournament at his own graduation, which tells you how far these parties had been allowed to get before someone bothered to write that rule down. So, did owning a piece of a medieval university make anyone rich? The bishop signing the charter, the scholar paying for his own feast, or neither of them? The first misunderstanding is picturing a university as a place at all, a campus, a set of buildings someone owned outright. That's backward. The word itself, universitas, meant guild in the 13th century, the same word a group of dyers or blacksmiths used for their own trade association. A medieval university was a corporation of people, not a piece of real estate, and the single biggest decision anyone made about running one was which group of people actually controlled the corporation. There were 2 working answers to that question, and they produced 2 completely different businesses. At Bologna, the oldest university in Europe, founded in 1088 around the study of law, the students held the guild. Older and wealthier than the typical art student, training for careers serving popes and kings, they organized into nations by home region, elected their own officers, and since they were the ones paying the professors' salaries, treated the lecturers as employees who could be managed, disciplined, and fined. At Paris, which grew out of the cathedral school attached to Notre Dame, the arrangement inverted completely. The masters held the guild, controlled who could join their own profession, and answered to almost nobody below them. Most universities founded afterward, including Oxford and Cambridge, copied Paris's version, not Bologna's, which makes Bologna worth examining first, precisely because it was the exception, and an exception shows the mechanics more clearly than the rule does. Before either kind of guild could fine anyone, though, a scholar first had to survive the price of admission. Getting to that final feast took years, and money changed hands at every stage along the way. The standard path ran through a bachelor's degree first, then another 2 to 4 years of lectures and disputations before a scholar was even permitted to sit the examination for a license to teach. 5 to 8 years in total, most of it spent as a paying customer of the very institution he hoped eventually to be paid by. The fee structure at the University of Vienna in the 15th century survives in unusual detail, and it shows how granular this got. Simply registering and matriculating cost 12 kreuzer in the arts faculty, 24 in theology, law, or medicine. But the price was not fixed for everyone. A member of the lower nobility paid 30. A duke or a bishop enrolling paid 3 full guilders, 180 kreuzer, 15 times what an ordinary art student handed over just to have his name entered in the register. A separate initiation fee followed, marking a new student's formal entry into the student body. Then came lecture fees, which varied according to which text was being taught, and disputation fees on top of those, revised upward more than once as the century wore on. Exemptions existed for the genuinely poor. This was not, on paper, a closed shop for the wealthy alone, but one modern estimate of the whole process concludes that reaching a master's or doctorate cost roughly as much as, or more than, an entire year of a student's ordinary living expenses, stacked directly on top of those living expenses rather than replacing them. Then, at the very end of all of it, came the expense nobody had warned him about at the start, the inception itself. This was not simply an examination, it was a public induction followed by a feast, and the feast is where the system quietly extracted its largest single payment. Fees were charged separately by the university, by the assembled college of doctors, and often by a church official standing at the ceremony besides, and only after all 3 had been settled was the new master expected to personally fund a banquet for his examiners, his new colleagues, and his friends. It became extravagant enough that the statutes had to intervene. New doctors were made to formally promise not to overspend on fees and feasting, and were explicitly forbidden from staging a tournament as part of their own graduation, a rule that exists only because someone, at some point, had tried. Different cities layered their own flourishes onto the basic feast. Sweden added cannon fire. At Louvain, The graduate was carried through the streets in an ornate ceremonial chair. In Spain, he received a sword and a pair of gold spurs and was expected to reciprocate by funding an actual bullfight for his guests. Wealthy families treated the whole spectacle as inseparable from the cost of the degree itself. On the same footing as a wedding, a public performance a family could not decline to fund without appearing to have failed in front of the entire faculty. By the time it was over, the ceremony meant to mark the beginning of a scholar's earning life had frequently cost as much as the years of study that preceded it. Only now, fees paid, feast finished, debts in some cases still outstanding, could he actually stand in front of a room of paying students and start collecting fees of his own. That turned out to be a far less dependable business than the years of preparation for it might have suggested. A master at Bologna begins his lecture the instant the opening bell stops ringing, because two of the students seated in the front row are not there for the finer points of contract law. They are there to watch him. From 1317 onward, the law faculties elected two ultramontane students from north of the Alps and two cismontane students from the Italian side with one specific function: report the master's failures to the guild. The position had a name: denunciatores doctorum, denouncers of professors, and it was not an informal grumbling committee. It was a formally mandated office, voted into existence by the same body that paid his salary. The offenses they were watching for were written into the statutes in detail. Arrive after the bell had stopped, and the fine was 9 Bolognese pounds. Finish before the correct hour, or fail to work through the assigned material by the end of term, and the fine followed just the same. Skip a difficult passage in the text because it was hard to teach rather than because it wasn't required, and that too was punishable. The statutes made no allowance for a master steering students away from material he found tedious or beyond them. A rector could even fine a master for attracting too small an audience, on the reasoning that the students had collectively paid for instruction and were owed a room worth attending. A master needed the rector's permission simply to leave the city, and in many cases had to post a bond before he was allowed to lecture at all security the guild held against his own future misconduct. The same way a merchant might demand collateral from a business partner he didn't fully trust. None of this made a Bologna master powerless, though. The masters ran a countervailing body of their own, the Collegia Doctorum, one per faculty, and it controlled the one lever the student guild couldn't reach: entry into the profession itself. Examination standards, degree requirements, and frequently the examination fees stayed under the master's authority. A rector could fine a lecturer for a badly attended class. He could not decide who got to become a lecturer in the first place. However precarious a master's year-to-year income looked, the profession above him remained a closed shop, gated from the top. 200 miles to the north at Paris, none of this machinery existed, because the guild ran in the opposite direction from the start. The license to teach was granted by the Chancellor of Notre Dame to whoever the assembled masters judged fit to join their own ranks. No elected rector fined a Paris master into line, because no student guild there held the standing to fine anyone. Entry was harder and more political than at Bologna. Survival inside the profession, once granted, was considerably calmer. It's this Paris model, not Bologna's, that most subsequent universities in Europe ended up copying, Oxford and Cambridge included, which makes Bologna's fining system less a universal picture of medieval teaching than a uniquely aggressive experiment that the rest of the continent quietly declined to repeat. Even Bologna eventually conceded the limits of its own design. By the late 14th century, the city itself had begun supplementing professors' pay directly from tax revenue because income collected one lecture fee at a time from an audience that could shrink or vanish for reasons entirely outside a master's control wasn't dependable enough to build a university on by itself. If the most tightly regulated fee system in Europe still needed a subsidy to function, the fees themselves were never going to be where a university's real financial weight came to rest. That weight, as it happened, was accumulating somewhere almost nobody watching a lecture would have thought to look: in the trade supplying the books. A theology student walks into a stationer's shop near the university quarter holding a list of texts assigned for the coming term. He isn't there to buy a book. Nobody in this shop sells a finished, bound volume a student could simply carry home and keep. He asks which section of the set text is currently free. The stationer checks his register. The fourth piece of 31 is available for the week. Everything before it is already out, in the hands of other students' scribes being copied. The student pays the fixed rental fee, carries the loose, unbound sheets home, and returns them 7 days later to collect whichever section happens to be free next, not necessarily the one that follows, since another student may still be holding it. This was the PCS system, and it existed because the university had a supply problem no amount of enthusiasm could solve on its own. Before the printing press, every copy of every legal, medical, or theological text had to be produced by hand, copied from an earlier handwritten copy, with small errors accumulating at every generation. 4 new universities appeared in Italy alone between 1222 and 1231, and demand for personal copies of set texts climbed every year after. Monasteries, which had traditionally supplied most manuscript copying, simply could not keep pace with a student population that size. So the universities built something closer to a licensed, regulated publishing operation. Attested in at least 11 of them, 7 in Italy, 2 in France, 1 each in Spain and England, the system worked the same way nearly everywhere it appeared. An official bookseller, a stationer, held a verified master copy of an important text called the exemplar, checked line by line against the original before it was approved for use. The stationer then split that exemplar into small, unbound sections, usually about 8 pages apiece, and rented them out one at a time a week per section at Bologna to students or the professional scribes students hired. Because the text existed as separate loose pieces rather than one bound volume, several different people could be copying different sections of the same book simultaneously, which is precisely what let the system keep pace with a growing student body, not faster individual copying, but many copyists working in parallel on the same underlying text. Becoming a stationer was not simply a matter of opening a shop. A candidate had to pass a formal inquiry into his standing and professional ability, provide guarantees, and swear an oath before the university would license him. Once licensed, he operated inside tight constraints rather than a free market. Rental prices per pecia were fixed by the university, not the stationer, specifically to keep access affordable regardless of demand. He was required to rent to anyone who asked and to publicly post what he currently held in stock. If an exemplar was later found to contain errors, the stationer who had supplied it was fined the identical enforcement by fine instinct that governed tardy professors, redirected here toward a different kind of failure. In exchange for submitting to all of that oversight, a licensed stationer received privileges most tradesmen in the same town could only envy: exemption from certain local taxes and the right to have any dispute over his business heard in the university's own court rather than the town's. The book trade was never formally part of the curriculum. It was, in practice, part of the university's jurisdiction, one more piece of the town operating under the guild's authority rather than the mayor's. None of this made the university treasury itself directly wealthy. The rental income went to the stationers, not to any central university account, and the entire apparatus disappeared within a generation once the printing press made hand-copied pici obsolete. What it demonstrates instead is how far a university's real gravity extended past the lecture hall into bookselling, parchment making, scribal labor, an entire regulated knowledge economy answering to university courts instead of civic ones. Substantial and still not where the lasting personal fortunes in this business were actually built. For that, the story moves away from fees and rentals entirely, and toward a bishop who never once stood up to lecture. The bishop from the opening scene has a name, William of Wykeham, and by the time he sat down to sign that 1379 charter, he had spent 30 years demonstrating that none of what follows required him to have ever taught a class. He was born around 1324 in Hampshire to a family with no title and no significant land. His first position was as a clerk to the constable of Winchester Castle, and his early reputation was built not in a lecture hall, but on a construction site. He supervised the rebuilding of Windsor Castle for Edward III, and that competence at managing large, expensive projects carried him directly into royal administration. He became the king's principal secretary, then keeper of the Privy Seal, then, twice over across his career, Lord Chancellor of England. Along the way, he collected the standard reward for that kind of service in the 14th century: church income, rectories, prebends, canonries, and archdeaconry, the keepership of a dozen royal castles and manors, a portfolio of revenue, every bit as precarious as anything a lecturing master relied on, because each stream was tied to an office or a king's continuing favor, and all of it would have reverted to someone else the day Wykeham died. His innovation was not accumulating that income. Plenty of royal servants managed that. It was refusing to let the income die with him. The 1379 charter secured a college at Oxford, formerly St. Mary's College of Winchester in Oxford, almost immediately shortened to New College, endowed with land and property on a scale contemporaries considered equal in magnificence to the buildings themselves, sufficient to permanently support 100 members of the foundation. He had already set the other half of the mechanism running 3 years earlier, a linked grammar school back home in Winchester, chartered in 1382, built for a single purpose, educating 74 boys and feeding the most promising of them directly into his Oxford College, a feeder school and a university college designed as one system, funded as one system, built to keep operating long after the man who designed it was in the ground. The mechanism kept working exactly as intended for a very long time afterward. Decades after its founding, Winchester College expanded its own endowment by financing the construction of a large roadside inn at Andover, a business with nothing to do with education, generating rent from travelers who would never sit in a lecture hall, let out to a tenant who managed the daily risk while the college simply collected. That is the Endowed College, working precisely as designed, an institution that had outlived its founder, still acquiring income-generating property decades later, still converting a bishop's long-dead royal career into cash for scholars who never met him. The model was copied almost immediately because it amounted to a formula any sufficiently well-beneficed churchman could follow. New College's own sister foundation, King's College, Cambridge, was built on the identical twin institution template roughly 60 years later, feeding boys from Eton directly into a linked Cambridge College. Once one bishop had shown that a career's worth of royal favor could be converted into a self-perpetuating income machine, every ambitious clergyman with a comparable pile of offices wanted the same trick for himself. What made the Endowed College different from every other income stream examined so far was durability, not size. A master's lecture fees stopped the day he stopped lecturing. A stationer's rental income depended on continued demand for one specific text. Wycombe's foundations depended on neither. They held land, and land does not need to be popular, competent, or even alive to keep collecting rent, which raises an uncomfortable question for an institution built specifically to survive its founder. What then was actually strong enough to threaten it? The threats fall into two categories: the ordinary kind, which hits any institution depending on a steady flow of paying customers, and one that is close to unique to universities. The entire enterprise could simply get up and walk to another town. Take the ordinary kind first. In 1349, the Black Death reached Oxford, and by the time it had passed through, roughly a quarter of the town's lecturers were dead. Every fee-based income stream examined so far, a master's lecture fees, a stationer's rental income, depends on students arriving and staying alive long enough to keep paying for instruction. A plague year does not simply reduce demand, it kills the people supplying it too, and no institution in 1349 had an instrument that paid out for either loss. 6 years later, on the 10th of February 1355, a very different kind of risk announced itself, and it began, of all places, in a tavern. Two Oxford students, drinking at the Swindlestock, complained that the wine wasn't good enough. Words turned into a thrown cup. The cup turned into a brawl. The brawl spilled into the street, where the town's mayor rang the bell at Carfax to summon armed reinforcements. What followed was 3 days of open fighting between town and university student lodgings broken into and ransacked, scholars killed in the open street, some reportedly scalped. By the time it ended, roughly 30 townspeople and as many as 63 members of the university were dead. What happened next mattered more than the riot itself. The king had the mayor imprisoned in the Tower of London. The Bishop of Lincoln excommunicated the entire town, and when the citizens were finally absolved, the terms of that absolution became a standing sentence. Every year, on St. Scholastica's Day, the mayor, the bailiffs, and dozens of named citizens were required to walk to the university church and perform public penance for what their predecessors had done. The obligation was confirmed by royal charter in 1357, reconfirmed more than 2 centuries later under Elizabeth I, and continued for generations beyond that. A single riot provoked by a complaint about wine hardened into a permanent legal advantage for the university over the very town it depended on for food, lodging, and labor. Proof that when the argument was over jurisdiction rather than money, the side holding a royal charter did not lose. But no charter could stop scholars from simply leaving when a town became unbearable. And that threat ran under the entire system. The University of Cambridge exists in large part because Oxford does not have a monopoly on English scholarship. It was founded in 1209 by scholars who abandoned Oxford outright after townspeople lynched 2 of their fellow students. Bologna has its own version of the identical pattern. Repeated clashes with local authorities sent dissatisfied scholars to found rival schools at Padua, Modena, Vicenza, and Arezzo, each new foundation quietly bleeding prestige and tuition income away from the original city. A university's core asset was never really its buildings, its stationers, or even its charter. It was a portable guild of people who could, and periodically did, simply reconvene wherever the terms were better, taking every future year of rent, fee income, and book trade with them when they left. So, a disease that could empty half a lecture hall's benches overnight. A jurisdictional conflict that a single complaint about wine could ignite into a 3-day massacre. And beneath both of those, the standing possibility that an entire student body might simply relocate to a friendlier city if pushed far enough. Against all of that, the endowed model built to survive its founder had one advantage nothing else in this economy possessed. But even that advantage had limits worth measuring honestly. The endowed college's advantage was durability, but durability was never the same thing as immunity, and it's worth being precise about where the model's protection actually ended. New College and Winchester College held land, rents, and buildings, rather than a lecture hall full of paying strangers. But land, rents, and buildings were still land, rents, and buildings, carrying every risk any landholding carried. A tenant could default, a roof could fail, a property could burn. The Angel Inn, built decades after Wycomb's death specifically to grow the college's income, was exposed to everything an innkeeper anywhere in this period faced: a bad harvest driving up the price of his own grain, guests who left without paying, a fire that could take a timber structure down in an evening. What the endowment changed was not the presence of risk, it was the concentration of it. A master's income depended on a single variable, whether enough students showed up this term. A college's income depended on dozens of variables spread across dozens of properties, so that one bad harvest, one disputed rent, one damaged roof rarely threatened the whole institution at once. That is a genuinely different position. It is not the same as having escaped the underlying economy altogether. With that caveat in place, the two businesses can be measured side by side. Consider a strong year for a popular master, the kind of scholar whose reputation drew students across mountain ranges to sit in his hall. Matriculation fees, lecture fees tied to whichever text was being taught, disputation fees at term's end, a full room generated a genuinely comfortable income, and under a system like Bologna's, that full room did more than pay the bills, it actively protected him, since a rector could fine a master for attracting too small a crowd, subtract his guild dues, the bond posted against his own conduct, and the cost of keeping a schoolroom running, and a popular master in a strong term could clear a living that, by one modern estimate, matched roughly a full year of what it had cost him just to become qualified to stand there in the first place. None of that income converted into anything beyond the term that produced it though. When the term ended, so did the revenue. Nothing carried forward except a reputation that had to be earned again from nothing every single time. Now consider a bad year for the same master. Plague halves his audience the way it did to a quarter of Oxford's own teaching staff in 1349. Or a riot like the one that tore through Oxford in 1355 sent students fleeing to Cambridge or to Padua, wherever felt safer that season. Either way, his entire asset, his standing crowd, his ability to be worth listening to, evaporates along with the audience. There was no equity in this business, nothing to sell, mortgage, or pass to an heir. When the crowd stopped coming, the business simply ended, and it restarted from nothing only if the students eventually returned. A college in a bad year looked entirely different, and this is the whole point of building one. A fire at a single property, a defaulting tenant on one manor, a disputed field a day's ride from Oxford. Each of these was a real loss, recorded and sometimes litigated for years. None of them, on its own, threatened New College's ability to keep feeding and housing its scholars, because the founder had spread his bet across enough separate income streams that no single failure could reach all of them at once. That, in the end, was the entire purchase. Not a higher return than a gifted lecturer could earn in his best year, but a structure that could absorb a bad year without ceasing to exist. Which brings the story back to the two men it opened with. The scholar funding his own graduation feast was paying in full for the right to enter a business with no equity, no inheritance, and no protection beyond his own continued ability to fill a room, a business that could make a gifted man comfortable for exactly as long as he kept lecturing, and not one day longer. The bishop signing his charter was doing something categorically different, converting 3 decades of royal offices, none of which would have survived him by so much as a week, into an institution that has now outlasted him by roughly 6.5 centuries, still collecting rent, still funding scholars who have never heard his name. Both men, in their own way, got exactly what a medieval university had to offer. Only one of them was ever going to be remembered by what he left standing.